Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Prima Vista Festival, and a very special and peculiar event because, as you see, it's going to be a launch of a horror book. And as our festival's theme is Small World, and I was leafing through oRepeater books, new releases, it struck me as a very apt addition to the program, because after all, it's about the beyond. It's about what is beyond our normal everyday experience, and all kinds of the inexplicable that makes our human world small. And just to introduce briefly our today's guests, well, Tariq Goddardi, who's a publisher. Well, I actually met Tariq a few years ago in Bristol at an avant-garde music quiz, and it's very strange incident that happened last year, because when Tariq and Matt Cahoon were going to come to Tartu to talk about Mark Fisheri, but COVID restrictions didn't allow that, and we did an online event which proved very popular and had thousands of viewers, mostly from London. And that gave us the idea today to run a kind of hybrid where we have Tariq Goddardi and Christiana Spence, who's the artist of the book, here, and also reading their selections from the book. But I also asked several contributors to the book to provide an audio or video of their selections or comments on their selections to the book. So we also have today Susie Connor and Carl Neville and Claire Cronin as presences on the screen. And we have Underground Forest, who's going to soundtrack the readings live. And we have Matt Calvert, who's going to run the Q&A with Tariq and Christiana, and the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for coming here this afternoon. Can everyone hear me without the mic? Is that all right?
You have to sit down for that.
Oh, I have to sit down. I can't stand and read. Okay. Just going to adjust my pitch slightly.
But let's do Susie Connor first.
Okay.
A Haunted House by Virginia Woolf. An introduction by Susie Connor. I often find myself getting lost down these Google-fueled curiosity spirals. We start with, what Sanskrit words do we still use in English? And end up 2 hours deep into the slave trade of the Circassian people. The literary pathway of the phrase, every ghost story is a love story, was a particularly tangled one. When it comes to the intertwining of ghost stories and love stories, I've been hooked for years. My fascination, okay, let's be accurate and say obsession, of feeling the traces left in houses, hotels, cars, and other evocative spaces we inhabit, of the longings, loves, passions, and traumas of those gone before, has echoed into my writing and films with increasing repetition. The spaces I've been most obsessed by are the proverbial little house in the forest, full of lost dreams, reverberating from it into the trees, as if a gramophone was left circling inside, and the salacious hotel room containing all the world's loneliness, isolation, and sexual tensions within 4 walls of steaming, smoke-stained red velvet. As I was thinking through which story to choose for this anthology, and the earworm every ghost story is a love story would not leave me, Virginia Woolf sprang up immediately, a master at capturing the traces of longing and lost love within so few yet such evocative words. A very short story, A Haunted House, being a perfect example. Woolf is, for me, a spectre in herself, I wish I'd never heard her recorded voice for one thing. That piercing Queen's English will forever remind my ears of exactly which class we're dealing with here. Reading her now, I can't shake the feeling that she's sat in the corner of my room, hands folded neatly, pretending not to time how long I take to read each page. A haunted house is set in Ashton House, her own haunted home, which she and her husband Leonard would jaunt to on weekends. According to Leonard's diaries, the sounds of two long-dead people could be heard every night in that house, walking room to room, sighing and whispering intently. All right, so if Mr. Wolf can admit it, I can too. Confession time. The reason for my own fascination with these traces is that I've lived in haunted houses of my own and stayed in haunted hotels, among other spaces. The most vivid instance was age 21, shooting a documentary in an abandoned girls' orphanage in West Sydney one winter morning. Yeah, go figure. Some of the crew and I saw and felt the traces there so clearly that I shut myself off from this sort of thing for years out of terror, and also because I couldn't get any damn sleep. Years later, I slowly started welcoming the traces back and making peace with them. And A Haunted House is one of the most beautiful instances I've read of this ability to make peace with whoever loved and lost before and still lingers in space. All these years later, I think I've finally learned how to stop being terrified and find the light in the heart of things, as Wolf so achingly describes it. So back to the E1. D.T. Max, writer of The New Yorker and author of Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace, had originally attributed the phrase to D.F. Wallace. But when Max had asked Wallace himself about it, he credited the phrase to none other than Virginia Woolf. I learned this just yesterday, thanks to the Google spiral. The news prickled over my skin with the uncanny coincidence of it all.
Right. I'm going to read a story now, a short story called Par Avion by Marlene Dotard. And it's a story told from the point of view of a ghost. I did not know I was dead. Marlena was on one knee clutching her face on our stone kitchen floor. In my desire to console her, why I did not know yet, I was aware that I could neither stand nor speak. The ease with which I could see all sides of the room at once and move about as I pleased was liberating, like being granted the freedom to fly with one small condition attached. I could no longer meet the simplest of my objectives. How was this lack to be explained? It was difficult to know what time of day it was, twilight or dusk. And in spite of this being our home, there was more in the room, more in everything than I had sought to notice before. In this new light, dark as it was, objects and feelings I lacked terms for were exposed as different, familiar as they still were in certain respects. Marlena, while evidently the woman I married, appeared as a huddled concoction of shadows and sighs. The peeling paint on our shutters, a collapsing sunset, and the yellow daisies our daughter had drawn on the pale milk walls before I left for the front, the unvisited flower beds of the world. Insight prohibited the enjoyment of these treasures. They could only exist for those who understand them yet, and the awful realization that I had crossed a threshold forever came over me. Though I could not communicate any of this, neither could I leave. The one counter to my feeling of utter weightlessness that gave flesh and substance to my disembodied spirit was Marlena's torment. This alone, feeding on my love and desire to comfort her, defined whatever it was that I had become. If I could trace a path back to my old self, I could perhaps return as I was, and reverse my unfortunate transformation, or even wake up before the memory of my life faded for good. But this was no dream, for as bizarre as my predicament was, I knew I was still in the world of facts. I had been killed for the second time in my life. The first death had occurred when the protected existence of the womb erupted into the world. But that too had ended, only I still did not know how. Was it a few hours ago, or had months passed since I ceased to be a man? It was useless to consult units of measurement when the answer I sought was in my wife's face, hidden from me. Her fear was the clue. The Foxhole, where a small and supple shape hid amidst the deafening compression and noise, waiting until the clamour of the shelling stopped and the whistle blew. To part with the instinct to survive, stand to my full height, and embrace the steel cacophony that awaited us sons of France was my last worldly act. And after that, this blissful communion with the consoling breeze that had brought me here. No time had passed. I looked across to check for my epaulets, but there were no shoulders to wear them on, nor head for my kepi, puttees to envelop my legs, or hands to hold a pistol or a cane. Marlena has felt my passing, because she has seen my decapitated ghost hovering in pieces above her on the ceiling of our kitchen, far from the front. I now know that if I can accept that I am dead, I will be free to deliver my message. The intolerable force of her sorrow is the anchor that draws me towards her. Yes, she will understand everything once I cease to deny the inevitable and allow our souls to align in perfect knowledge. Our narrow lives will open out towards our shared destiny and celestial dissolution. The body lying in the vaporous mists on the Marne, a skin I have shed for good. Though we can never meet in this world again, my spirit will eventually fill the entirety of her being again, and she will know me once more as she does now. Now Arlene stands up abruptly, as if she has heard something, and wiping away her tears, looks about the room cautiously. Then, pulling a wedding photo out of her apron pocket, she turns it on its back, and with a pencil taken from behind her ear, she quickly starts to scribble something down. As Marlene transcribes the opening line of her first novel, A Dedication to Me, I sense a darkness at my shoulder. I am not alone. Her love is letting in more than myself. I cannot stop this malignity from entering unless I undo the unity of our souls and renounce our bond. And it knows that it is already too late for that. A rat scuttles across the floor and then another. I cough. Marlena winces and sneezes into her hand. There is blood in her palm. I close my eyes and watch her fingers lift a sheet over our daughter's face. Dr. Beak casts a torch and burns this house to the ground. And processions of cattle carts creep through the shuttered streets of our town while I hover above, an agent of destruction for all I have fought to say. Flies are gathering at the windows. Marlena touches her neck and perspiration breaks over her forehead. There is fever here and the plague spinning in its spores. I have joined her in life and in doing so condemned the living world to death. I touch her face, but all she sees are the sunken red eyes of the abyss. Disease is pouring through the decaying cavities of its grotesque smile, drawing her soul back from whence we came, where she will know me once more, as she does now. My vital energy is theirs, billions of wriggling beings passing through my extremities to Marlena, following the path of our love into beds of wild flowers and butterflies. Thank you. Christiana.
I'm going to read from Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat.
Use the mic.
Can people hear me? Or should I, yeah, mic. Hello? That's a bit better. Is it loud enough? Yeah. Okay. For the most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not, and very surely I do not dream, but tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me they have presented little but horror. To many they will seem less terrible than barroques. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy, I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity in procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black, and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mentioned the matter at all for no better reason than it happens, just now, to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favourite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change of my disposition. I not only neglected but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol? And at length even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when in his fright at my violence he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fibre of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from its socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I penned the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse, for the crime of which I had been guilty. But it was at best a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented in its true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by the evident dislike on the part of the creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit philosophy takes no account, yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perseverance is one of the most primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or silly action, for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law, merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffended brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose around its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse of my heart, hung it because I knew it had loved me and because I felt it had given me no reason or offence, hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and most terrible God. I think I'll leave there.
I first read The Monkey's Paw when I was a child, and prior to rereading it for this volume, the Book of the Occult, I'd only read it once. Barrow-in-Furness, where I was born in 1970 and grew up, is a shipyard town in the northwest of England. Barrow Island, where we live, is on the opposite side of the yard from the town itself, a series of terrace streets and pre-war flats built as accommodation for the workers. I don't know the exact age at which I read it, but it's before I was 11, when we still lived in the first house I ever lived in, 13 St Andrew Street. The street ran down into a vast green area of allotments, occasional factories, abandoned houses, disused reservoirs, artificial lakes, and ponds with decaying wooden jetties and shoals of fish, mysterious fenced-off areas belonging to the shipyard, burnt-out cars, abandoned JCBs, areas of dumped concrete flints. This was the wild, mysterious topography we explored as children, and that ringed the massive docks that allowed the ships and submarines made in the shipyard to pass out into the Irish Sea. I'm certain that we still lived in that house, number 13, because the scenario that plays out in The Monkey's Paw took on a vivid and immediate life due to my surroundings. It was impossible for me not to imagine that the family in the story were my own. Not merely because I was a child and my experience was limited, but also because certain features of the story were evident in my daily life. The bareness and narrowness of the domestic scene, the occasional visitor from outside who's seen something of the world and returned with tales of adventure, the sense of relative isolation, the lack of money, and the disavowal of any need for or interest in it, the focus on the child, the son, as the locus of the parents' hopes. The story's world and my own overlapped in ways I couldn't fully articulate at that age, but understood in the implicit way a child grasps things. The process of that implicit understanding progressively becoming explicit, shifting and recomposing the world around them, making the familiar strange, renders the world the child inhabits, no matter how dismal or threadbare, numinous with the uncanny. And so I was doubly susceptible to the story's particular power. The Monkey's Paw isn't only a story about class, but class is an inescapable central element to the story's horror and pathos. Industrial accidents weren't common in my hometown in the 1970s, but they weren't unknown, and there was always an underlying tension to the working day. Occasional deaths were reported. A friend's father was hospitalized for months due to a fall from scaffolding. People lost fingers and toes, eyes. Would my own father one day not return punctually at 4:30, half an hour after the siren that could be heard all over the town, and the signal the parameters of a normal working day sound? The sense of inexorability in the story, of vast, uncontrollable forces and trajectories, derives partly from its being so short and compressed, and because the dread and horror accelerate so quickly. There's no sense that either the protagonists or the reader have time or space to escape confronting the father's awful moment of decision. But the sense of a relentless and unavoidable momentum was something I too felt pulling at me. The life described in the story, the dominance of industry and a life circumscribed by the inevitable and unavoidable route into the factory, also seemed true of the world I saw around me. I was on the path that led me and the overwhelming majority of my classmates into the yard, a treadmill that my mother and father were trying in the limited ways they could to get me off. I had a fate they were trying to help me avoid. Perhaps the death of a son in an industrial accident was my fate too. If not that exactly, for a bright, imaginative, working-class child, son of a bright and disillusioned working-class father, there would be something close to death, something that mangled and deformed. Years on the shop floor and on huge and dangerous machines, for little pay and mean surroundings, always dreaming of the larger, more expansive life as some great mechanism whose workings we could feel but not see had kept us from. The invisibility of the forces shaping and directing our lives, intangible yet as tightly binding as steel bands, manifested in us, avowed atheist, humanist, and rationalist though our household was, as a thick, sapping, and unacknowledged undercurrent of superstitious fear. Fear of the punishment that forces out there, beyond the small, knowable arenas of family, home, shipyard, town, might inflict on us for attempting to have more, for not knowing our place, for unsettling the immutable and time-honored order.
Hello, everyone, and congratulations on the season of fear starting today. I mean, it's the first day of the fall, if I'm not mistaken. Let's get right to the meat of it. No, I'm okay.
I'll very quickly say that the music just there, I don't think Carl Neville could have captured the sound of his childhood any better than you did there. It was wonderful. Thank you very much. And for the other accompaniments you've done.
Oh, that's a good place to start with the non sequitur. You, Tariq, have written extensively for Quietus, a music magazine. Have you ever come across music that has similar properties to the mimetic virus in Mark Twain's tale? And what kind of music has the greatest overlap with the occult, in your opinion?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think it's a two-parter. So all music, I think, works like the music in the Mark Twain thing. It doesn't need to be satanic or dark or melancholic or depressing or even especially powerful. All successful music will have that sort of psychic, physical, visceral, holding you. Even shit music works like that. So, I know, even better than good music sometimes can. So I think that is a given about music. And I mean, just walking around here this morning, I don't listen to things on earphones as I walk. And yet I begin hearing songs. And, sometimes they're actually playing, but usually they're not. They're just in here. So I think that is a function of all music, for music to succeed. What music for me is most haunting or occult or unpleasant, or wholesome and affecting. I think the music of Coil is some of the most unnerving and discomforting. And it reminds me of the scene in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Mr. Tutmus the Fawn poisons the girl's drink to ensure that she passes out and falls asleep so that the White Queen can kidnap her. There's something really beguiling and pretty and beautifying, but also a kind of quite malign and evil at its heart, that you can't enjoy an unfettered or unfiltered connection to it. As for what music sums up the occult, well, I mean, clearly Dark Throne. I mean, most death metal is deliberately aiming and striving for that.
Overtly.
Yeah, overtly, which means that it can sometimes miss its target, but nonetheless, it's hollowed out a dimension that carries something of supernatural, irreducible fear with it, just like being scared of spiders or something. My personal favorite music that speaks to occulty feelings is probably the Sisters of Mercy and Shirley Collins and the Fairport Convention. So, that folk music can often do that. But I think the doomy melancholy of the Sisters of Mercy is where I first began hearing literary effects, occult literary effects in music.
Thank you very much. Two of the more fascinating and concise stories in the selection, Marlene Dottov's Barabian that you read, and Punch Brothers Punch by Mark Twain, both explore the intersection of fantastic horror and infectious disease, which is especially poignant at the time when we're living in the grip of both a serious worldwide pandemic as well as a kind of mimetic virus of bad ideas born out of magical thinking that appear to be working against us hand in hand. Would you agree that our predilection to mysticize unseen threats and to enjoy fantastic horror narratives spring from the same source? And what would speculative fiction look like if humans were inherently reasonable? You want to answer that?
Sure, yeah. I think they do come from that same place. I think it's perhaps a seeking of... I think one reason people love horror films and horror stories is a seeking of that catharsis. It's a facing of fears. And so rather than have a diffuse threat, it becomes focused on one obvious like monster or devil or whatever. And if anything, it's a very healthy way of dealing with that psychological need, as it were. And then you mentioned the sort of politics of fear. And I think it's the same impulse, but obviously it's projecting this diffuse fear onto, a scapegoat or, another, or, I think he calls it, Stanley Cohen calls them folk devils, and, in his book about moral panics. And so, I think it's the same desire to have one symbol or one person to pin all of this fear onto, especially after a particular, social crisis like a pandemic or terrorism or whatever. But I think, and all literature to some degree, but especially horror literature really enables people to sort of work through that fear and anxiety in a obviously less destructive way. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, I think so.
Just to add to that, I think also there's, so much part of what this collection was about wasn't simply addressing ghosts or, horrific figments of our imagination. It was looking to see what was literally true about these things. And there's a sense in which most of the things that happen to us daily, we know how they work, but we don't know how or why they're there. And in fact, for us to, even cross the shortest distance between 2 points, we are surrounded by things we don't understand. Consciousness, every morning I wake up, I take it for granted, I live in it, it's all over me, it's already wearing my mind, but I don't know how it happened, or where it's located in my body. And that's just to start with. You know, as you proceed, you are surrounded by things that you don't understand, that you nonetheless name and then take for granted. And after a while, they become like the furniture and you get used to them. And horror is the opposite of that. It's saying that all these ways that you familiarize the great amount of unknowing, necessary unknowing in the world, is a device to put you at ease, when in actual fact, you should be tense. You know, you should be worried, or at the very least, you should be questioning.
Thanks. Up until reading the book, I had thought of the occult as sort of a set of tools and techniques aimed at achieving quite specific magical goals. In practice, a kind of mental alchemy. The anthology appears to broaden this definition to include pretty much everything unexplained and or otherworldly. Can you tell us what the occult means to you, and which one of the stories in the book of the occult encompasses the most occultishness?
Well, I would think that I wrote the essay on the black cat, so obviously I'm biased. That's the one I would focus on. It's funny because in the essay about it, I deconstructed, and it's all about masculinity and fragile masculinity and all of these things. But we had a little discussion about this where I think all of that is true, and he's questioning, you know, this binary and so on. But Tariq was right. I think rightly pointed out that I think Poe was superstitious and did believe in the occult and did believe that this sort of thing could happen. And I believe that too. Like I had a black cat, and that's probably why I picked this story. Who basically, I had a really wonderful cat growing up, and then it died during the funeral of an ex-boyfriend person who was incredibly occultish. To put it mildly, he was like, he had a rows of skulls in his living room, and he was like the Prince of Darkness and all of this stuff. So the fact that my cat died during his funeral was already quite strange. And that then my reaction was, oh, I need to get a kitten. I wanted a new cat, and I wanted a kitten, but there were no kittens in the cat shelter. And then this incredible black cat, really like long-haired black cat, was on the top of a bookshelf and just stared down at me and sort of seduced me. I was like, okay, fine, I'll take it. And so I had this, but it was evil. It was an evil cat, and like I loved it, but it was evil, and everything it did, like it went into a cupboard and found this silk antique painting of three sisters. I'm one of three sisters as well. And it tore out all the faces. It was an evil cat. And then, yeah, it was just so weird. I was like, you know what, there you go. The occult is real. And then I eventually sent it back to the cat shelter because I was pregnant. And I was like, no way. So that's my story of my black cat. But I think there are two sides. There's like the kind of using the occult to understand reality better and to say things about how strange and unreasonable we are as people. And then there is the actual world of bizarre things like these black cats. And I can't explain them, but I think it's interesting to talk about them. Yeah, exactly. Do you have a story?
I don't have an anecdote as good as that, no. I think the occult is the religious sensibility taken out of the religious moves and conventions and tied to a sort of mystical belief that isn't at all moralizing or looking to provide a code for how people should live, and instead understands the irreducibility of the big concepts that govern our life, like good and evil. And that though there are stories we can tell about it that are useful and helpful, they are in the end just that, and that our understanding is always partial and limited, even though the thing we're understanding is absolute, massive, and prevalent, and has an objective truth in the way that religion believes there are objective truths. As to the other half of your question, which of these stories best encapsulates my sense of the occult, I'd actually say it's Eugene Thacker, my co-editor, whose idea the book was actually. His book, The Willows, not his book, sorry, the story he chose, that for me is probably the most profound, the deepest, and the most suggestive of stories, because it seems as though there's a parallel world running across ours with its own laws that govern its own conduct and types of behavior, that we have this extremely limited sliver of interaction with. And in doing so, we look to try and build it into our world in reality and understand it as a consequence of that. Whereas in actual fact, it's got nothing to do with us. And for me, this isn't an anecdote that could compare with Christiana's. It's like falling asleep in a room in the afternoon, which I don't do often because I'm a hardworking writer and publisher. But when I would in this specific room in my in-laws' house, I would hear a parallel conversation going on between two girls. And it wasn't especially scary at all. It wasn't terrifying. It wasn't the stuff of a ghost story. But it wasn't in the room. It wasn't happening. There were no material people speaking, but they were talking as they would if they were existing and referring to things that clearly belonged in the universe that they inhabited, which wasn't ours. And in the hypnagogic state between sleeping and dreaming, for about 10 or 15 minutes, I'd be able to phase in and out of this. And they didn't know I was there, in the same ways I didn't know they were usually there. And you get that in Eugene's choice, The Willows, where these monstrous shapes live amongst trees and consume humans if they happen to see them, which they usually don't, because this is an island on the Danube or Rhine or wherever it's said. So that's probably the most practical manifestation, in my view, of the occult, although Eugene chose that one.
Historically, fantastic fiction has not been very inclusive or representative of women minorities. So I think it's quite laudable that your compilation contains several stories by female authors, especially The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, deeply critical of casual male chauvinism of the time, as well as highlighting the tragical plight and exclusion from society of women with mental health issues. Christiana, you wrote in the introduction to Poe's Black Cat, A Chilling Tale of Domestic Violence, that men project their insanity, chaos, and monstrosity so that they don't have to admit it to themselves. Their suppressed feminine characteristics transform into everything they fear of: femininity, madness, sin, submission, only projected onto something else, whether a cat or another person. Would you like to expand on that? Is the horror trope of monstrous men suppressing femininity losing its relevance or usefulness in the current progressive liberal climate?
I'm not sure if it's losing or... I think it's still relevant, yeah. I think you articulated it all quite well, so it's hard to expand on it exactly. No, but it's interesting. I suppose I think of it as a wider case of the sort of this idea of like the Enlightenment and Romanticism, and that's sort of like a general suppression of Romanticism, which is thought of as feminine. So I feel like that's kind of interchangeable. In terms of sort of the current discourse, I think it's quite confused actually. And even that is something that is quite scary to people, like this idea that we might contain multitudes, as it were, or we might be complex, we might be one thing one day and one thing another day. And fluid, strange, incomprehensible people, who cannot be reduced to one label or one state even. And like, I think that's what this narrator is terrible. Well, obviously it's about alcoholism as well, and that's quite an important aspect of it. But even the fact, this idea of drinking as an excuse to have emotions, he's very clear, like, I'm not really like this. It's the demon drink that has possessed me and caused all of, the demon, I'm being possessed by the drink. And it's caused all of these things. It's not me, it's the drink. So you have this Jekyll and Hyde type of situation. And I feel like that's a very common trope in horror, especially Scottish horror. There's so I grew up in Scotland, so and it feels like part of the psyche that there's this Jekyll and Hyde aspect, particularly of men, whereas women, although have traditionally been called witches or persecuted for being the feminine or the evil feminine rather, they don't have to suffer the this sort of schizophrenic idea of having to be one thing or another. So I find that quite interesting. I suppose it's like the effects of sexism and this binary on men and the male psyche. I find that quite interesting, and I'm not sure it is often that explored. So I do think it's more relevant than ever. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just add to that, yeah. A lot of what makes the horror in this work is the notion of what normal is to the characters in the story. And because so many of the characters in these stories start with a view of reality and normality that we would regard as mad, really, but with such a rigid view of what it constitutes to be a normal, straightforward person living in dominant reality, trusting the evidence of their senses and all the rest of it. Because it's such a narrow and insane view of life, horror is a way of puncturing that and overthrowing it and saying, actually, what you call reality isn't. You need to adjust your ideas. Look at this. What do you think now, kind of thing.
Thank you. The Lovecraftian horrors in Unseen, Unfeared by Frances Stevens, or her real name, Gertrude Burroughs Bennett, as well as the dread apparition in Green Tea by Sheridan Le Fanu, are mostly explained away, as well as the Black Cat by Alcohol, are mostly explained away by the effects of mind-altering poisons. Indeed, there is a hypothesis that ghosts and hauntings are invoked by psychedelic molds in old buildings, playing tricks on people's minds. Do such rational explanations take away from or add to the enjoyment of fantastic and horror literature? And does our addiction to narrative thinking make literature itself a kind of mind-altering drug?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the big differences in our collection from most collections on horror or most views of horror is that a lot of horror writers, and I wrote a horror novel about 12 years ago, and I went to quite a few events with them. And I was really surprised that most of them didn't really believe in what they were writing. I mean, they were very good writers. They certainly wanted their characters to believe in the truth of what was happening to them. But, there were often people with no belief in the supernatural, and no standard rational materialists, basically. And that means that when we look at horror, we're always looking for the analogy. We're always looking for, well, what's it really about? Here are these zombies. I guess that's probably consumerism, not that dead people can actually walk. And one of the things I encouraged our contributors to do, and did myself, is choose things that could literally be true too. Yes, you've got that rational explanation, the mold, the drink, the undigested bit of meat, that gives you these dreams you have in the middle of the night that make you think there's a spectre at the foot of your bed. But ones that could actually literally be about what happened. And my feeling is, yes, you're right. Magic mushrooms will, encourage you to believe trees could talk to you. That's because trees probably could talk, and you need to be on the mushrooms to realize it. So I think they're mutually complementary. Literature can work in the way that you suggest this does as well, as a high entertainment and diversion. But in the same way as I think horror should actually show you what is horrible about life. And, literature should do the same thing. I think literature, just as an entertainment, powerful and necessary as that is less important than literature as something that makes you engage with existence, being alive, reality, all that stuff.
Not mutually exclusive.
There's room for both, but I think if you only had to have one, I would want literature in the severe style and not literature as a holiday read.
Thank you. Also, returning to the Willows a bit, I imagine I might have found some quite well obscured insinuation in Algernon Blackwood's story. I did some digging around, and in a blog post from 2015 by someone called Tranchen de Carmelengo, who writes, reading Blackwood, one gets the very distinct sense that he actually liked men, whether he intended to or not. There is plenty in his work that could be constituted as homoerotic. in light of this, it seems to me that the narrator's adventures in the Willows with a burly male companion called the Swede might have some hidden libidinous undertones, especially where he describes swirling flood carrying them in shore and then sweeping them out again, and how they shot with a great sideways blow from the wind into a backwater and managed to beach the bows in a cloud of spray. So, you know where I understand where I'm getting. Is that interpretation feasible, and are there perhaps any other literally occult, in the sense of hidden messages in the stories in your compendium, meant to be detectable only by those in the know, the chosen few?
Well, I'm probably something to say about this too, Christiana, but one of the interesting things in that story is quite often horror is about madness. You're the only person that can perceive something. It's only you. Everyone else tells you you're mad. So in fact, horror doesn't exist. You're just mentally ill. That's often how it goes with horror. It emphasizes solipsism and the fear that you are the only one with privileged access to truth. In this story, both the characters actually believe in the reality of what's happening. So I think what you're saying, yes, you know, it is, of course, homoerotic, as well as being a horror story about this parallel dimension. But in this, it's very telling that the Swede keeps telling the protagonist, shut up, stop, don't say anything. He's like, but look what's happening. You know, our boat's been moved by something. The Swede's like, quiet, just, they could hear you, just be quiet. And it's very interesting that in this story, to say something is worse than ignoring it. To say something about what actually exists is at once more embarrassing and more frightening, acknowledging it, than the fact that it's there, which is incontestable. So I think that's consistent, of course, with mutual attraction between men at a time when it wasn't exactly encouraged. But it's also true of how, in general, you know, in England in the 70s, it was more embarrassing to call attention to paedophilia than for adults to fiddle with children. You know, it was more societally embarrassing. So it hits on a very important truth, which is that being open about things and acknowledging them is more horrific for many people than the fact that horrific things exist. But yeah, I mean, obviously it's completely consistent with your reading as well.
Yeah, so I suppose The Black Cat it's about alcoholism. It's also about domestic violence more than anything. And so, yeah, it's hard to explain, but I suppose I find it fascinating that he has to wrap up this domestic abuse story in the story of a supernatural cat. You know, like that's in a way more palatable to people than a standard story about a violent man. So that was sort of my view of it. That people, and I suppose it was written a long time ago, so maybe things are a little different now, but I found it quite revolutionary that he should write that book, which is so obviously about a man doubting his manhood, as it were, and his sanity and everything else, but also in a very obvious expose. Like he mentions hitting his, like, you know, taking out violence on his wife, but he kind of brushes over that and talks about how it kills a cat, you know, or tortures cat, kills cat, all these things. Kills the wife. Oh yeah, exactly. It's hard to give away everything, but you know, like it's almost it's more palatable to talk about cruelty to an animal, you know, than it is about another person. It's almost like the horror story conceals the real horror, perhaps more horrific horror story, or that he focuses on, and I suppose he sort of fetishizes the killing of the cat because he tells it in a very indulgent way as well. There's a sort of sadism there, and he talks about how he's shocked at himself. I guess from a psychoanalytic point of view, I find that interesting as well. You know, he's at once repulsed and he's reveling in his story, his final confession. He's getting something out of it. There is some sort of enjoyment there, but he also seems to be genuinely repulsed by what he's done, and notice repressing what he's done to his wife. He's making a confession more about the cat than about the wife that he's killed. You know, so I do find this, what we pay attention to and what we focus on in stories and accounts and confessions, in itself quite interesting.
You're the author of, among other things, Shooting Hipsters, which is definitely a book about politics, among other things. And you're a member of something called the Truth Tellers Collective, which I understand is a group that analyzes and creates artistic responses to political events at King's College in London. Did any of the stories in the Book of the Occult inspire you as the illustrator on these terms? I mean, do you see any of them as overtly artistic responses to political events of the time?
It's difficult. I would say the one that resonated most with me was the yellow wallpaper. And that was perhaps, I think it was one of the first that I did, and the one I sort of enjoyed, and I definitely had more of a connection with in political, personal and political sense. And her feeling of claustrophobia and terror, and this, as you mentioned before, this not believing women, and obviously women typically being accused of madness if they had any sort of protest against the way they were being treated. And that comes across in a slightly different way in The Black Cat. So I found those two stories interesting to have to read together. But yeah, I would say that was the biggest connection of all of them. In the Truth Tellers Collective, we tend to, the most recent thing we looked at was the Manchester bombing, and we were looking at the sort of the rituals people have after a huge crisis like that, and all the shrines and religious iconography, whether or not people believe. And so I think that links into it, the sort of ritualistic need to make sense, or to have a routine, or to have a sort of weird, slightly obsessive group reaction to something. And so that's always in my mind when I'm thinking about stories like this as well. The occult, even, like the need to have something ritualistic to deal with things, and to sort of the strange obsession or obsessiveness about that, but on a huge group scale.
Thank you. Tariq, you are an accoladed writer, having won awards for everything from comic literature to horror writing. Can you tell us a bit about your own approaches to fiction, and what will the forthcoming novel, High John the Conqueror, be about?
My approach to fiction is to read all the time and to try and write a little all the time. And were I not to do that, I would go mad, and I would also lose my self-esteem and the pride that I have that's necessary for me to exist, whether people are reading my work or not. My new book, High John the Conqueror, is it's the first book I've ever written in the first person. My other books have all been third person. So it's the first book that I've kind of talked instead of written, but I've had to learn how to write talking. So it's counterintuitive and much harder to write than anything else I've done. And it's about, relevantly enough, a series of occult disappearances that are occurring in the area of South Wiltshire that I live in. And the first person that's gone to be interviewed says, posh people are stealing our children. And my narrator is assigned with finding out what's going on. So it involves mysticism, class, darkness, and transcendence, because people are quite literally vanishing and disappearing. And the first line I can give you is, I always wanted to be a writer, but I became a policeman instead. So my, policeman is informed by a kind of literary sensibility. Just very quickly, one thing you said earlier about music, speaks of this stuff. Music does most successfully also when the singer or the musicians encounter it almost by mistake as a consequence of trying to do something else. So in the music of the Cranes, for example, I got the feeling that they were looking for something very oppressive, very claustrophobic, but there was something about the wavering of her voice that almost spills into this other realm and retains it. And that kind of discomfort, where you have a writer that looks like they are perhaps trying to write a parable about politics, and instead discover something else in the room that's appalling and not what they thought they were writing about. So I think that's how horror often works very effectively. where you reach the limits of what you can explain, and yet the thing you're talking about's there, you know, and you sort of found it by mistake because, you know, it wasn't the effect you were striving for. It was something you encountered on the way.
I think horror is almost always also about transgression. And, in a recent take on college cancel culture and the TV show The Chair, New York Times' Michelle Goldberg writes, "It has been jarring to go from an intellectual culture that prizes transgression to one that polices it. Is it possible that horror fiction, an aesthetic incorporation of the very idea of transgression, is the last safe, or rather deliberately unsafe place for those who appreciate the importance in art of offense, trespassing, and violation of societal norms?" Who wants to answer that?
Okay. I mean, I think any censorious culture of critique is so bound up in critique that it isn't actually creative or productive. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter what, you know, what kind of criticisms are being made by people who are looking to inhibit artistic expression. Writing is an involuntary impulse, and you will be able to write. You won't be able to help yourself from writing, you know, in whatever genre you're working in. Horror, because it can be fantastical, does at least give you the get-out clause of course I didn't mean it. You know, I'd have to be mad to. But that's a sort of bad faith. And if you're seriously looking to communicate something that other people are not like, you will do that anywhere and with anything, I think.
Yeah, in terms of whether it's like safe from over criticism, perhaps. I'm not sure. I think maybe horror is okay, but crime fiction, I've noticed lately, there's been a lot more, perhaps rightly so, but, you know, people complaining like, why are the victims always women? Why, you know, there's this tendency to have female victims, and there's some sort of sadistic or voyeuristic tendency with all of that, you know.
There's the girlfriend in the freezer trope.
Yeah,
in
it's
comics that it's just like about how the supermen become supermen by finding their girlfriend murdered in the refrigerator.
Yeah, no. So I think some people speak out against that. I think it's just an interesting thing to explore, though. I doubt that anyone is going to be forbidden from writing another of those books. If anything, it's just that maybe there are too many of them, and writers would be slightly better to look down at, you know, to sort of have a little bit more self-awareness, perhaps, or to explore why you might jump to one thing. So I don't think that that's necessarily negative, but I don't think that crime or horror is necessarily immune from over-criticism either. So just from that, yeah.
Although the book of the Occult is mostly composed of previously published stories, I assume that does not apply to everything you guys put out. So why is the publishing house called oRepeater Books?
I'm going to give you a really quick answer today. My old publisher, I started with a group of friends with Zero Books. And when we left Zero, we were forced out, and it became apparent that we were leaving behind our asset. And a lot of good work could have gone for nothing. So we had to think very quickly and on our feet about a new name for a publishing company in a tiny amount of time. And as anybody that has ever tried naming anything, I'm sure, would testify to, naming something is, it's harder to name the band than it is to record the first album sometimes. So much seems to hang in a name. So I very quickly wanted to find something that said that this is us basically doing the same thing again. I found, and I don't spend a lot of time online, very little in fact, but I found that oRepeater is sending out a transmission for the second time more strongly. And I also happened that afternoon serendipitously, destiny, to be listening to Fugazi's Repeater. And about the 30th time I hadn't changed, and it was just repeating again. I thought, this has come together extremely tidily. Let's put a full stop here and, leave the sentence in the right place.
It will be definitely easier to remember it now. I know we touched on this subject a little bit, but in connection to On Ghosts, the essay by Mary Shelley that's in the book, it bemoans the loss of the magical beauty of the unexplained and the perceived triumph of mundane rationality. Would you agree that history has proven such fears unfounded, and that despite us now knowing how underground rivers and icebergs work, we will always have feeling hearts on which is bestowed the belief that influences do exist to watch and guard us, though they be impalpable to the coarser faculties? Or are we in danger of scientific progress really extinguishing everything for that fantastic without providing new mysteries to tickle the sense of awe and wonder enjoyed by our less informed forebears? Or to put it another way, is the earth a tomb, the god is sky a vault, we but walking corpses?
Your questions deserve their own book.
Yeah.
No, you don't.
I feel like with science, it answers some questions and then it raises so many others. So I found this, my son is 6 and I feel like he's much more into science than I ever was, but he's just constantly asking questions. And the more he learns, the more questions, and the more I realize I don't know. And I suppose especially with like space and the universe, and then with philosophy as well, like the more you read, the more, whether it's philosophy or science for that matter, the less you know in a way, and you just become more and more aware of how little you know. I remember like when I started a philosophy degree, well, in the interview I said like, I just wanted like, like an introduction, like a sort of an overview of the main things, and he just laughed at me and said like, that's what everyone says. It's like, don't be like, people spend their entire lives doing that and they never know anything. Like I think there's a quote, isn't there? Like, all I know is that I know nothing. It's Socrates, I think. Do you know which one? I can't remember the specific quote.
We both did philosophy.
Yeah, we both did philosophy.
Right.
I know. Whoops. It was a long time ago, to be fair.
Lots happened since.
Yeah, and then forgetting is the other thing. It's like you learn, you forget, you repeat. I don't know. I think there's something to be said for practice, like having a practice, and there being a certain wisdom in that. So maybe she was talking about that a little bit as well. Of like, I think perhaps in modern life, the reason writing is a craft as well, but I like drawing and printmaking because of this sort of at times mundane craft where you have to do something every day, and there's something about that, like especially something you're doing with your hands, or there's something in the physical world. So I suppose sports and things could come into it too, but I think perhaps we've lost that these days, and that practice in itself gives rise to sort of imagination and a different relationship with the world. So slightly on a tangent, but I feel
I hope we're not completely lost.
Sorry,
there is still hope.
A very quick go at that, because I think, I don't know, wonder, just sheer appreciative, trembling and awe at being is as useful a category as rational analysis is. I know it can make it seem as though I'm being very romantic, and that keeping mysteries alive is somehow thrilling. And that isn't actually how I look at things. The reason why I believe in the things I do is because they give me the best explanatory principle of being alive, and not because I want them to be true. So if I have a sort of conventionally romantic view of the world, it isn't because I want to cultivate a romantic aesthetic. It's because there's something about reality that compels me to understand it romantically, because that's what it's like. So I don't really feel, mystery is, going anywhere, or it really is under threat. just because, you know, people have now said that they've discovered string theory isn't correct. You know, well, what difference would that for me is neither an argument for or against reason. You know, it's just an argument for how something you think happens, you know, happened. So I don't think that magic or ghosts or anything like that will be any less relevant to our understanding of ourselves and existence in 100 years than they were about 200 or 300 years ago. Though I could see why 200 or 300 years ago people might worry that, you know, the world was going to become some completely known quantity, which of course it isn't.
Seeing as it's cold as a witch's tit in here, let's draw this to a close. And what's next for you guys, and what's next for Repeater Books?
What's next for Repeater Books? Yeah, we know you. We're going to talk about Christiana's book and what's next for Repeater Books. We've got dozens of amazing books coming out next year, and by and large, I think they're necessary books that, even though we've been going for a while, and the kind of books that we do, other people are beginning to publish and doing as well now.
Did you say dozens or thousands?
Dozens. Okay. Thousands would be absolute hoovering and signs that the mushrooms were kicking in. Yeah, all the pause in here were driving me mad. But there are books that I can't actually imagine anybody else releasing, you know, and there are dozens of those. So we'll carry on doing that, and look to make them as mainstream and as reach as many people with these sorts of books as we can. But you know, just we've had a profitable year. We're not going to go bust. There's a hardcore constituency of people that love what we're doing, and we're, you know, reaching more converts. So I'm confident that there's I'm confident I'll be doing this till I retire, you know.
Yeah, and then I'm writing a book for Repeater called The Fear, which is, so it's quite nice to have done this event and have this fresh in the mind again. But that will be about things like scapegoating, gaslighting, politics of fear, and how all of these things sort of coalesce and interact. So certainly writing this essay on Edgar Allan Poe I found really a useful springboard almost for the next book. And then that will have illustrations as well, similar to this one. So,
great.
Yeah.
And Christiana's doing the illustrations. It's like mutual complementary society, keeping each other in work. She's doing the illustrations for my new novel, the beginning of each chapter as well.
Oh, and then there's the book on heroism.
And yeah, we'll bring a book out on heroism as well. And Christiana's done the illustrations for that one too.
The group effort.
Yeah.
And the in-house, basically.
That sounds great.
Yeah. So I think it will be similar to this, except different writers have written essays on figures, whether they're just, you know, family members or not very, very famous public figures, but
We basically encourage people to not go for Gandhi, Tolstoy, or, you know, Nelson Mandela, but somebody that had personally affected them, even if it was a figure in the public eye. And also talking about the usefulness of leadership and heroism, which are two things that, especially on the left, are not particularly fashionable at the moment. It's another book, another story. Anyway, thank you very much for coming, everybody.
I'd like to remind everyone that books are available, both the Shooting Hipsters and the Book of the Occult by Repeater Books. Thank you very much. It's been fun.
One more video greeting as well.
Video greeting, okay.
Real horror. There have been periods in my life when my interest in or ability to watch horror goes away entirely. When my cousin was killed violently in an accident a few years ago, I didn't want to look at any images of ghosts or the undead. Months after her death, my grandfather also passed away, and my family returned to Buffalo to mourn. At the funeral home, I was too scared and sad to stand close to his casket. From across the room, I saw his body lie, all powdery and white, so clearly void of him. The next time I watched a horror film, home safely in LA, I thought about how strange it was. A real dead body in a room with me, and I could not go near it. So different from the scripture of dead bodies I had memorized from screens. At the nursing home before he died, my grandfather mistook drifts of snow outside his window for lost children. The orphans, my mother says he called them. Do you see them? It looks cold out there. Why doesn't someone do something? It's sad. The ghosts are sad. The ghost story, a genre about sadness. Horror, a genre about pain and fear of pain. Like melodrama, horror is a realm of excess weeping. Pain becomes a landscape, pain in absence of redemption. If Christ died on the cross without a resurrection, image of those bloody prayer cards passed around at Sunday school. The Sixth Sense, 1999. A boy who communicates with spirits that don't know they're dead seeks the help of a disheartened child psychologist. Statement of defense. Horror fans are often asked to explain why to people who don't like or understand the genre, to offer an apologia. There are many reasons, many theories, as specific and as varied as the horror subgenres that viewers pledge allegiance to. The pleasure of a thrill, the appeal of what's taboo, personal or cultural catharsis, the comic, camp, absurd. But I've always felt haunted. A ghost can lose her sight as a result of her identification with her father's blindness. There's something about watching ghosts on screens that satisfies this personal unprovable. Human as a haunted house, body with a tomb inside, a wooden box where locks of hair sing secret hymns.
Okay, thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to our performers. Thanks to underground terrorist down there who's been doing the music. Let's see if we can get him on frame. And on your way out, please also step by from the Utopia bookshop corridor, because Christiana's pictures from the book are there for exhibition, also today and tomorrow. Okay, thank you very much. Books are sold here.